Welcome. I'm Jenny McFarland. I'm with the Tucson Audubon Society, and we're going to be talking about grassland winter bird surveys. We're doing a protocol training in person, a workshop, but also we wanted to make this video for people who can't come to the workshop or people who get involved with this effort later when we have already done the workshop. So we're going to cover some of the basics of how these surveys work so that everybody knows what to expect on survey day. We do have an actual protocol that you can read and digest and read all about longspurs and about the best strategies for finding them, but I wanted to just cover some of the basics because sometimes reading something is helpful, but seeing it can be even more helpful. So the first thing I wanted to just look around at this habitat. This is Las Cienegas near Sonoran in southeast Arizona, and this is one of our 2 global important bird areas for Chestnut-collared Longspur. And this is one of the 2 sites that Tucson Audubon does as part of the Important Bird Areas program. Now I also want to note that this protocol that we designed to do these surveys, components of it may be used by other groups to be doing survey efforts in slightly different habitats, focusing on different species. And I want to note that, so if this video is for those other efforts, if you're watching it as one of those other efforts, just take from this video what applies to the version of the protocol that's been shared with you by the coordinator of that effort. So this video is going to be assuming you're part of the Important Bird Areas winter grassland surveys. If you're doing another effort, just take the components that apply to you. So first of all, this is Las Cienegas. This is the exact kind of habitat that we do our surveys looking for chestnut-collared longspurs. We do record all species that we encounter, but some of our methods and our timing and all that is really focused on longspurs because they are our primary target. So our surveys have sort of 3 main parts, the chestnut-collared longspur surveys, where we take a large area like this entire valley, the Las Cienegas grassland valley, a very large area, and we go out as teams on survey day. And every team has their assigned area, and it's like several miles of road plus the habitat around those roads. So every team has their specific area, and they're not supposed to overlap with each other so that we can get a good clean estimate for the day of how many of all these species that we're counting. So the general overarching structure of the day is to have each team sort of move through their area very methodically and slowly, looking for flocks of birds. The thing about chestnut-collared longspurs is, on their wintering grounds, they get in these big groups and they can move throughout the valley. So it can make it kind of difficult to know exactly where they're going to be. It's not like they're always along a creek or something like other types of bird surveys where it can be more predictable where the birds are going to be. They are very seed dependent. They like especially the native grass species seeds. And they have these little foraging areas that they like, and it can change year to year. But one of the things they do consistently is they come into tanks. So these cattle tanks or these like cattle pond structures, they really, really like those. The fact they eat so many seeds, to digest all those seeds, they need to drink pretty regularly throughout the day. So they tend to come into tanks and drink, and it's a very predictable place to find them, but it's by no means the only place to find them. So using these general knowledge about chestnut-collared longspurs influences how we've designed these surveys. So there's several things that you as a team will do throughout the morning. One is you're going to move through your entire assigned route area, in your vehicle. And if you see a good place that looks good to you and you want to get out and run around and look for longspurs, that's great. That's totally fine. Or if you see a bird and you want to get closer and go off down a side road within your area, that's encouraged. That's totally fine. So we do a few things on your clipboard here, and we're going to have a second video inside where we do a closer look at exactly how to fill out data forms. But just generally what you do as a team is you have your cover sheet, which is a very important page. You want to put everyone who was there, exactly where you were, the date, the time, and then the weather information. And we'll do this in more detail in another video. But this is a very important sheet, so make sure that gets filled out because it helps us later looking at data figure out exactly who was there, when they were there, and where everybody was. It's very, very important. And then we keep a general list throughout the day. You can almost think kind of Christmas bird count style, where you're kind of keeping a tally of all the species you and your team encountered throughout the morning within your area. And for that, we're going to use a transect survey sheet. Okay, you're just going to keep a general sheet of all the species that you found and sort of keep hash marks of how many you found. Another really popular way for teams to do this is through eBird, and that's totally fine. If you want to designate someone to keep an eBird list throughout the day and then at the end transcribe it onto one of these sheets, that works really well. So if that's how you want to do it and someone in your team knows how to use like the eBird app on their smartphone, that's a very good way to do it. I highly encourage that. But if no one does, you can just use a data form throughout the day. So that's how we started doing these surveys, was just sort of driving through your routes, using our experience over time as to where we often found the longspurs and then looking for them there. We've now been adding layers of precision to our surveys. So that is the overarching structure of the survey, but we do smaller, more precise surveys in specific locations throughout the morning. The second component, that's the first component, is just sort of the general list for the morning. And then we have a separate data sheet. If you find longspurs anywhere along your route, you see a good piece of habitat, you go out, you try, oh, this looks good, and then you flush up a group of longspurs, you and your team. There's a special data sheet you need to pull out. It'll be in your packet that you're going to put specific details about those longspurs because they are our target birds, so we want extra information about them. You're going to put the exact coordinates of where you found them, how many there were. It's very difficult to count a flock of longspurs as they fly away, so use your best estimate, and you do need to estimate. And if you really think it was 50 or 100 that flew away, go ahead and put that down. Birders often, almost always, radically undercount how many birds are in a flock. And if you take a photo, that's another good way to do it too. But using the best of your abilities as a team, come up with a solid number, a solid estimate, and it can be an estimate, that's totally fine, of how many you think there were. And then the data sheet walks you through some of the other questions. What were they doing? What direction did they fly? It's also going to ask you explicitly if there are native or non-native grasses in that area. And the protocol covers how to tell the non-native from the native grasses with photos. And specifically the non-native grass that we're going to see out here is almost certainly going to be layman's love grass. So, and the protocol has photos and all that to help you understand what layman's looks like. And once you get the hang of it, it's actually quite easy to tell layman's from the other grasses. So it's going to ask you a few questions specifically about the longspurs, where you found them. So if you do find them, make sure you pull out that sheet and fill it out. So that's happening just in the course of the morning. And then another thing that every team's going to do is there are identified cattle tanks and cattle ponds within your route. You need to visit those. And the protocol covers this in more detail, but you need to visit each of those tanks and ponds and then watch them for a set amount of time and see if any longspurs come in to use the tank. It's a good idea to walk around the tanks and see if you flush any up, because sometimes they're just hanging out in the low grass right near the tank. We may ask you to check certain tanks as a priority over others. It's good to check any tank you have time for, but we're going to have tanks assigned to each team that definitely need to be checked, because there's certain tanks historically the longspurs use quite a lot, and we've noticed features that many of these tanks share, but we're trying to definitively understand which traits that make a good tank or pond for these longspurs. So sometimes we'll ask you to check some that don't look so good in terms of what we think they like, just to make sure that they're not there in case there's a component we're not yet aware of makes a good tank for them. So tanks are an important resource, and we need to check them because the longspurs are often there, and we're also trying to better understand what makes a good tank. So as there's a special tank assessment data sheet that needs to be filled out for specific tanks that are assigned to you. The protocol will cover this in more detail, and we have photos of some of the different tanks in both Las Cienegas and San Rafael Grasslands to sort of demonstrate the traits we're asking for. So we're asking for things like how much vegetation is around a tank. What is the slope of the edge of the tank? What we're asking is, it is like a gentle slope where the birds can come in to drink, or is it more of a steep drop off? And you have to think of it from the size perspective of a longspur, a little bird, right? So it may not look that steep to you as a person, but you kind of have to think of it from their point of view. Is it a gentle slope where they could kind of walk in to get a drink and then fly away, or is it more steep? So it's some pretty simple questions. We also have some water quality questions. How does the water look clear and clean? Does it look kind of muddy brown like chocolate milk, or does it look scummy on top? So these are kind of broad swath categories, but it should be relatively, I think, simple to understand. And then the last thing we're doing, which is really important, is we're adding some short transects to everyone's route. So they're not on the road or anything. They're gonna be not too far from the road, but many of them will be near tanks. Some of them will just be in pure grassland. But we have partnered with Bird Conservation of the Rockies, who is doing a huge grassland survey effort in Chihuahuan grassland, as well as in the breeding grounds, focusing on chestnut-collared longspurs and a few other species. They're doing a very large effort, and we want to make our data that we're collecting as useful to their larger effort as possible. So they're doing very intensive, large-scale, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer plot surveys. That's not going to work for our volunteer-led effort, so we're doing 200-meter transect line segments, which I think will work very well within their protocol, since theirs is designed as a series of many 200-meter segments. So we'll do 200-meter segments, and then hopefully our results can fold into the results that the data that they're collecting on a larger scale. So, and they're not really doing much work in this area, so our contribution will be quite helpful to their effort. So we're doing these 200-meter transects. They will be plotted for you. These are specific areas, a specific line, 200-meter line. You'll have several of them in your section, because they're not, 200 meters isn't that long, so it won't take that long, but so you'll have a series of them to do. And it's a pretty simple protocol for a transect, and they need to stay, the most important thing about a transect is they need to be the exact same location every time, because we're going to do these transects year after year as a more sort of specific sampling way to track the location and the health of these populations of chestnut-collared longspurs in the wintering grounds. So I do want to do the transect portion of this video as a separate, smaller video, in case other efforts, other survey efforts use this protocol, so that then they can just, instead of listening to all this about grassland, wintering grassland longspur surveys, that doesn't necessarily apply to their effort. So to get more details on how to do a transect, watch the transect video. Thank you.